Salutations once again to the Truth Core, whoever and wherever you may be on the planet. I'm here with the fifth installment in the series Mythology 101. The title is The Mythogen Is The Dealbreaker. You may recall that I've discussed briefly the required occasion from time to time to set aside attention on the Maitreya mythica, the actual content of the mythic narratives, and to look at the method, the forensic techniques for evaluating this myth. I can tell you this is not easy. I have estimated over the years something like this. If you go to source materials, for instance, if you go to the Greek astronomer whose name is spelled Aratus, maybe Aratus, and you will find primary source materials. In fact, Aratus was not only an astronomer, but a mythographer. That means someone who writes myth. And so his book, called Phenomena, is a compilation of the stellar mythology of the constellations. So it contains not only astronomical data, but mythological or mythographical data as well. So if you go and read Aratus, well, that in itself is quite an experience to delve into that material. And we're lucky that such firsthand material survives to this day. But I estimated, as I began to say, over the years, that for every single book of primary source material that you read, you need to consider reading 4 books that tell you how to interpret it, that tell you how to handle the material. So again, I invoke the analogy of the crime scene. If you're in a crime scene, you're looking for evidence, and perhaps common sense would direct you immediately to some items of evidence, a bloody scarf, a knife. But when you compile all the evidence in the crime scene, well, then you have to do the forensic analysis. And it's the same thing with mythical writings that we have received from the past. So I don't expect you to do that, and I know you don't have the time to do that. I did that, so you don't have to do that. So what I'm giving you is the takeaway from what I've been able to study in my life of privilege. Now, as you know, as you're learning, the genre of comparative mythology has its jargon, like any other genre, be it golf or the CIA or the IMF. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to a term in the vocabulary of creative mythology, a term of my own invention. That term is mythogen. Now, immediately when you see the word mythogen, it cues you to pathogen. Is a mythogen like a pathogen? Well, it can be. As a matter of fact, the human mind, the psyche, is infected with pathogens, some of which are benevolent, some of which are not, some of which are toxic. And there is in particular one mythical pathogen which is extremely toxic, and that comes out of the Semitic background that I'm discussing and describing and interpreting in these talks. So what is a mythogen? Well, one of the things that everyone faces when you look into any area of mythology, let's take an easy shot, Greek mythology. Well, what do you find? A vast inventory of stories, narratives, incidents, actions, adventures, the 12 labors of Hercules, for instance. And so you find yourself confronted with a vast assembly of material. What you need is a tool that shows you how to select out of that material the most crucial information it contains. Now, exploration of mythology relies on asking the right questions. And in fact, I've been using the tool of the Mythogen all along. It's what enables me to ask the right questions so that I get to the core answers. So what is the Mythogen? It is that selection from the vast body of mythology of any race or culture that defines the identity of the people and their mission or purpose. It explains who the people are, and it defines their purpose in being here. So those two elements, mission and purpose, are the components of the Mythogen. So now when you go to any body of mythological material, you even take a small selection out of Greek myths, for instance, you can go to that material with this question. And does that material answer this question? In many cases, it will not. Let me just illustrate by two examples. Let's take first the Mayan origin story, which is contained in the Popol Vuh, or the Book of the People. By the way, I discovered a helpful site. You'll find it linked in the notes for Mythology 101, which gives you immediate access to the origin stories of many different cultures and races. So I'm looking at it right now. The origin story of the Maya peoples, compiled by Cynthia Stokes Brown. Now, what does it say about the origin of the human species? Well, hold on a minute. You're already savvy to that distinction. Does it say anything about the origin of the human species as a whole, or is it race specific? Does it only describe the origin of the Maya peoples who produced the myth? You see, by having that question up front, you're already on the positive side of the learning curve in mythology. So the Mythogen is a superb tool for forensic investigation of myth, and it is also the deal breaker. I'll get to that point at the conclusion of this talk. So here, in paraphrase, is what the Popol Vuh says. Bear with me, reading off the screen. The makers, that is the designers or creators in this narrative, tried to form a giver of respect, a creature who would nurture and provide. They made a body from mud, but it didn't look good. It talked at first, but then it crumbled and disintegrated into water. Then the heart of sky called on the wise ones, the diviners, the grandfather and grandmother spirits, to help decide how to form a person. The grandparents said it was well to take wooden carvings, human in looks and speech. So wooden humans came into being. They talked and multiplied, but there was nothing in their minds and hearts, no memory of their originators, their designers, no memory of heart of sky. Stop here for a moment. Heart of sky is the beautiful expression in Maya myth for the originator, the creator God, if you will, using Abrahamic language. And so the heart of sky wants to create a creature of respect. Respect to whom? Well, respect to its originator. And so the story goes on, and it takes a curious twist. The human beings created on the model of wooden carvings talked and multiplied. But then there came a great destruction. The wooden carvings were killed when the heart of sky devised a flood for them. It rained all day and night. The animals came into the homes of the wooden carvings and ate them. The people were overthrown. The monkeys in the forest are a sign of this. They look like the previous people, mere wooden carvings. It's lovely, isn't it? Already, can you get the richness of this material? I mean, what you actually have here is not only the inclusion of another mythic theme, the flood, but you have the notion that animals in this flood scenario came into the homes and ate the people. I love that. That's a great variation on the myth of Noah from the Bible. That is a sub-narrative in the Semitic myth. And in the myth of Noah, of course, Noah gathered pairs of all the animals in the ark, and they sailed away from the flood, and then they restarted the whole process of human civilization again after the flood. But in the Noahic myth, the animals are protected by Noah, the Manu, but I prefer the Maya myth that the animals ate the human beings who were, for some reason or other, misbehaving. And all misbehaving on the part of human animals is due to a lack of respect for the mother animal herself. You can put it down to that in each and every case. Now, looking at this brief sketch of Maya creation story, if you apply the Mythogen, you apply it carefully, like a scalpel, well, you can peel apart the layers of the myth and you can ask a valid question. Always ask this question: is the origin story race-specific, or is it generic? Well, it would generally be assumed, and it is assumed, I think, by most mythologists, that these race-specific origin myths are intended to explain the origin of the entire human species. And so you could give this case the benefit of the doubt. But as a matter of fact, it really doesn't play out. The follow-up in the narrative in the Maya version is only about the Maya people, you see. So even though, theoretically speaking, any origin myth could be assumed to be about the entire human species, when you follow the narrative out, it doesn't prove to be the case. Now, the flood motif occurs here as it does in many, many versions of mythology around the world, almost everywhere. It's one of the most universal mythological motifs. Here I might add, not as a digression, but rather as a footnote, an important footnote, it was the prevalence of the flood motif that allowed scholars at the end of the 19th century to bust the monopoly of the Semitic myth. You see, until that time, scholars, mainly white European men and women, were members of generations of people who had been indoctrinated by the Semitic myth, the special case of the chosen people, and the agenda that goes along with it. And there was a tendency to elevate biblical myth as the paramount story to guide the human species. But in fact, what happened in a series of dramatic events at the end of the 19th century, when comparative mythology really got up and running, well, the scholars of that time discovered that there were many, many older versions of the myth than you find in the Bible. Many older versions of the flood motif. And so they concluded, well, we've got to bust the Semitic myth. It can no longer be held as paramount, and it certainly no longer has a monopoly on human attention. That was a tremendous breakthrough, as you can imagine. So now, in continuity with the flood theme, let's look at the material from Greece. Now, actually, there are two primary creation myths, origin myths, coming out of the Greek culture. One of them concerns Dionysos, and it's a really fabulous story about Dionysos and the Titans. I'm not going to tell that story here right now, but I just want to point out that it is a myth that describes, it's a pre-flood creation story, and then there's a post-flood creation story, which I'll get to in a second. So in the pre-flood creation story from Greek mythology, human beings, presumably the entire race, the entire spectrum of races, was created from the ashes of the Titans. That's a fabulous theme which goes really deep. It's a deep mine of mythological wisdom. But what happened was that on the first occasion when human beings had the opportunity to populate this planet, the flood came along and wiped them out. So then you come to the second Greek myth, the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. So they are said to be like the primal parents, but in fact they are the ancestors of the post-flood humanity. So they alone survived the flood. And when they came out of that traumatic event, that catastrophic event, they realized that they were the only two people who survived. And so they applied mantique, or divination. They listened to the counsel of the gods, and the gods told them what to do to bring back humanity. They told them to gather rocks and throw them over their shoulders. And wherever those rocks landed, people would spring up. Now, this is a beautiful metaphor because it suggests, doesn't it, that the post-flood myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha applies to all the races. So it's race generic. But once again, if you apply this forensic tool of the Mythogen, you find what's in the follow-up. How does the narrative deriving from the episode of Deucalion and Pyrrha develop? Well, it only tells the story of the Greek peoples. You see? It doesn't tell the story. It doesn't expand into a full spectrum narrative of the anthropos, the anthropine species in its entirety. So there again, the Greek myth here is race-specific. But you can see the hint of the race-generic element in it. It's there, but it's just not developed. Wherever they threw the stones, maybe they threw some of them outside of Greece, and they would have then sprung up as other races. So what do you find when you apply the forensic tool of the Mythogen to any myths that you may be investigating? Well, you find that in some cases there is no mythogen, or no discernible mythogen. For instance, take the example of Nordic myth in the Kalevala, the national epic of Finland. It describes a primal man, Ymir. Many origin myths begin in this way. For instance, in Persian myth, the name of the primal man is Gayomart. And in Semitic myth, the name of the primal man is Adam. But, as I noted, that designation is deceitful. But back to, say, the Kalevala, which is one of my top favorite books of mythology. It's a huge, complicated, magnificent, mysterious, baffling, and enticing tale of shamanism under the northern lights. So that myth says that the first man was Ymir, and then subsequently the earth was populated from the seed or prototype of the first man. But who was propagated? Is the Kalevala, which is race-specific to the Finnish people, also race-specific in its origin story? Well, it's really hard to tell because there's not enough material to evaluate. But you usually can rely on the default function. If there is not something specific in the mythogen, in the mythic narrative of origin, that tells you that it's about the spectrum of the human races, you can safely assume that it isn't. Consequently, what you find, if you go through the realms and inventories of world myth, Polynesian, Slavic, Incan, Maya, Aztec, you name it, you find that only a few of them have a coherent and detectable mythogen. For instance, today I would ask my Scandinavian friends, and in particular, the Finnish variety, well, do you find your identity and your purpose here defined in the Kalevala? I don't think you do. Now, you might want to invent something based on the Kalevala, and that's a brilliant idea. I advise all students of mythology to revert to your ancestral mythology. Learn it, know it by heart, then see if you find the mythogen in there. And if you don't, well, it's time for you to invent what's missing based on your ancestral wisdom that comes from your creation myth. And all of those creation myths of the different races of the anthropos can be framed in the vast paradigm of the Sophianic creation story, the fallen goddess scenario. So that's about all you need to know about the mythogen and how it works. You can see how user-friendly it is, how you can apply it to any myth that you might choose to investigate. Why do I say it's the deal breaker? Well, it's also the deal maker. So whatever is the deal maker is the deal breaker, given that you have the choice to break the deal. Take a look at the Semitic myth of the chosen ones. It has given the world Abrahamic religion and a hell of a lot more, including communism. The Semitic myth, such a deal. Do you want to accept that deal? When you know the mythogen, you're free to say, no deal, no fucking way. That's why the mythogen is the deal breaker.